Death did not begin with pain, but with a smell. It seeped through the doorways, permeated the fabrics on the headboards, ate into the feathers, knocked the guards off their feet, and made the minstrels forget their notes. None of the courtiers dared to say it aloud, but everyone already knew. The king was dying, and he was doing so slowly. Beneath a veil of velvet and gold, a living body was rotting, and that body forbade anyone to touch it. The autumn of 1483 in France was damp. The walls of the castle of Plessis-lèz-Tours, which towered over the Loire, held not only moisture but also fear. King Louis, nicknamed the Spider, had not left his chambers for 3 months. He did not allow doctors to enter, ordered the cracks in the shutters to be sealed with wax, forbade anyone to touch his bed or body, and even his own daughter, Marie, stood crying on her knees at the door, begging him to open it. In response, only a heavy, wheezing breath could be heard. Sometimes there was convulsive laughter. The servants, admitted by personal order of the monarch, were changed every day. Not out of fear, but at the king's behest. Do not allow the infection to spread. Alas, the infection did not come from others. It came from within. According to the chamberlain Jean Gaultier, His Majesty's skin turned black on his stomach and thighs, the sores oozed, and the smell was such that the animals in the stables began to thrash about in convulsions when the wind carried the vapors to them. These words were later quoted in his treatise On the Diseases of Tyrants and Saints by Brother René de Lille, a doctor of the Franciscan order. No one knew exactly what had struck the king. Rumors circulated: mercury, slow poison, sacrilegious evil eye, syphilitic godless disease. But Louis himself knew it was punishment. He believed that Queen Jean's servants had secretly mixed holy mold into his food, and now his body was decaying because God had allowed it. He stopped eating meat, feeding only on quails and dates, washing everything down with wine infused with thyme and frankincense oil. At night he prayed in the dark, ordering that no candles be lit, lest the Lord turn away from my darkness. However, it was not only illness that tormented the dying monarch. Mold was growing not only in his body, but also in the minds of the courtiers. The heir, the Dauphin Charles, was increasingly receiving ambassadors without permission. The old Chancellor d'Argenson wrote in his personal notes, "The king no longer rules, he is rotting. And while he rots, we all live in fear that a single sneeze from his son will mean our execution." Envoys from Burgundy were sent back twice without seeing the sovereign. The Duke of Bourbon fled to Rennes in panic when he learned that the king had sent men with iron gloves to remind you who I am while I am still alive. Louis forbade even the treatment of his ulcers. When his personal physician, Mathieu de Saint-Lô, at the insistence of his confessor, tried to apply a bandage with vinegar and rosemary to the festering areas of skin, the king ordered him to be thrown into a ditch. "Do not touch me. I am already on God's judgment seat, and your fussing is only delaying my passing," he said, and the blood flowing from the corners of his eyes looked more like rust than living substance. He rejected the bloodletting suggested by the doctors from the monastery of Fontevraud with a cry, "You want to pour out the devil, but he is my only power." His lips cracked, his breathing became like that of a dog. He spoke to ghosts. At night he called for his father and one of his hanged advisers, saying, "You are behind me. I can hear you breathing on my neck." The castle began to fall into disrepair. The salted fish supplies were ruined, mice had gnawed through the sacks, and no one dared go down into the cellars. The windows were boarded up. Louis ordered that the bells be silenced. "Time no longer belongs to the living," he explained. The brass bell was removed and burned, for fear that the metal was cursed. The priest, Pierre de Charpentier, after hearing the king's confession through a closed door, later wrote, "He renounced the flesh, but not the throne. He will die on it, not in his bed. At this time, intrigues were tightening like a noose. Charles's supporters were already dividing up spheres of influence. The Queen tried to obtain the right to sign documents, but her chancellor was dismissed. Old advisers disappeared. Some of their bodies were found in the Loire with stones tied to their feet. One of them, Martin de Beau, keeper of the seal, disappeared after reporting in the morning that the papal legate's reports mentioned the phrase, "The king is dead, long live his son." Louis continued to waste away. According to the cooks, for the last 2 weeks he could not be fed anything but softened egg yolks mixed with rose water. His feces were bloody, and his urine was black sludge. At the same time, he continued to hold a pen in his hand and sign papers, even though his signature was shaking. Twice he personally gave orders for the arrest of 2 bishops who were allegedly gathering a posthumous council. The horror culminated on the night when the king ordered a mirror to be brought in. He looked at his reflection, remained silent for a long time, and then said, "That's not me. It's the raven that has been waiting for me since birth." 3 days later, he forbade even the removal of excrement from under his bed. The smell became unbearable. The windows were opened. It began to rain. Water dripped onto the rotting body, and according to one of the servants, he whispered that angels were washing his hands before burning his flesh. Bleeding sores reached his back, and pus oozed through his shirt. One of the monks described that His Majesty exuded not light but darkness, sticky and heavy. On the 8th day of October, around 4 in the morning, the king stopped breathing. But it was only 10 hours later that the guards allowed anyone to enter. Only a shell remained of the body. The skin had fallen away, the tongue was black, and the chest was swollen. A servant who tried to turn the body over lost consciousness. An attempt at embalming ended in failure. The entrails had stuck together, and the knife could not penetrate. The body had to be abandoned. It was wrapped in 10 layers of cloth soaked in resin. Louis's death created a vacuum. Charles became king, but no one recognized his authority. The dukes refused to attend the coronation until the body was presented. The papal legate left without receiving an answer. A crowd in Tours broke down the castle gates, shouting, "He was dead a month ago." Dozens of old enemies were brought back to court, each with their own claims. Later chronicles would call these weeks the time of the rotten throne, and it all started with one order: "Don't touch me." That sums up Louis. The morning after his death, the castle of Plessis-lèz-Tours was deserted. The corridors, which yesterday had been filled with quiet voices, the rustling of dresses, and the scent of myrrh, were now silent. The palace guards doubled their sentries but stood frozen. No one dared to approach the doors of the chambers where the body still lay. The order was unambiguous: bury without autopsy, without washing, without holy ointments. At the same time, the king left a formal will, written in his own hand in trembling handwriting. In it, he commanded that his body not be opened, lest Satan prove his victory over the flesh of the king. Doctors were forbidden to enter the chambers. The will was witnessed by 3 scribes and a priest, all of whom disappeared from sight within the next 2 weeks. One, according to rumors, drowned. Another was mauled by dogs in a nearby forest. The rest fled to Burgundy. The body was wrapped in a thick sarcophagus made of tarred cloth, fastened with lead threads. Under the cover, it continued to swell. The courtyard reeked of rotten honey and decaying meat. The senior knight, Chevalier d'Abron, declared that if the remains were not removed before noon, a plague would break out. According to his report, a copy of which is preserved in the monastery archives of Amboise, worms came out on the 3rd day and, finding no flesh in the tightly sealed coffin, began to eat away at the fabric. The body was hurriedly taken to Notre-Dame de Cluny. The burial took place at night without ceremony, attended only by monks. The body was lowered into a lime pit to avoid the smell. The embalming was never completed. When the coffin was opened, the carpenters lost consciousness. One of them, a monk named Jules, later blinded, dictated a testimony stating that inside there was no flesh, but a clot of black water, as if sin itself had eaten away the bones. This document was preserved in the monastery of Saint-Denis, but in the 17th century it was deemed excessive in tone. While the body decomposed in lime, the struggle for power flared up with renewed vigor. The new king, Charles, had barely taken the reins when his own uncle, the Duke of Berry, began to gather troops. Riots broke out in Paris. The crowd tore down the coats of arms from the houses where the late Louis's advisors lived. In the south of the country, supporters of the Armagnacs rose up, convinced that Louis's death was a sign from God that the kingdom would soon be divided. One of the cardinals who had arrived from Avignon declared openly in the square in Toulouse, "The abomination has gone into the ground, but its seed is rotting in each of you." Interrogations began in the palace. The old guard was replaced by a new one. Charles did not trust those who, only a month ago, had paid homage to the sick king. 3 former servants were arrested, allegedly knowing that Louis's illness was the result of an unclean ritual of revenge. They were crucified on iron stakes, a practice forbidden by Louis himself. No confessions were obtained. They died in agony. Charles paid special attention to his father's last confessor. It turned out that in his final days he had recorded the king's confessions on rough parchment. He claimed that the king had admitted his guilt in the execution of 2 innocent bishops and in ordering the burning of the monastery library in Beauvais. These confessions were not made public, but rumors spread quickly. Louis began to be called the cursed Spider Father. His image was painted over in churches. The people said, "He is not dead, he has been thrown down." But what happened to Charles was even worse. Just 6 weeks after his father's death, the new king revoked half of his decrees. But he had to do this surrounded by those who had not forgotten how much they feared the spider. Some generals refused to swear allegiance unless the real body was presented, but Charles could not do this. The coffin had already been flooded to stop the smell from spreading. One of the priests at court wrote in his personal notes, "The younger king lives in the shadow of a great corpse. He rules, but in every hall he feels the stench of the old body." The same notes indicate that every morning Charles fumigated the royal chambers with caraway and marjoram, as if trying to drive out not just the smell, but the memory. The paranoia that consumed Louis began to spread. Purges began. One by one, the deceased monarch's associates disappeared. Notes by the court physician, found in the archives of Saint-Germain, describe Charles' condition. "He is constantly scratching himself. I am sure that worms have infested his skin from the poisoned air. He screams at night and sees his father in mirrors. He has forbidden any reflections." France was entering a new century, but the rotten flesh of the old age still lived within its walls. By forbidding anyone to touch his body, Louis poisoned not only the air, but also the succession. His fear became contagious. Even years later, no one called him by name, only the one who would not let himself be touched. 3 months after Louis XV's death, it became clear in the capital that France was no longer being ruled. It was falling apart. Charles, crowned without proper ceremony, remained in the eyes of the nobility only a temporary guardian of the throne. Old alliances collapsed. Burgundy delayed its oath of allegiance. Navarre and the Armagnacs took up arms. The ambassadors from Naples returned home without receiving a reply. The border with the empire remained unprotected, and the coastal villages began to be abandoned by their inhabitants. Rumors of the cursed legacy spread faster than the heralds. Meanwhile, at court, investigations continued into the cause of the king's decline. The archive records written by Dr. Gaspard Devre, delivered to Paris by Charles's personal order, state, by the beginning of August, the body was covered with edema, and hot liquid could be felt under the skin. The ear shells and gums turned black, and the breath exuded a vinegary, metallic stench. Blood taken on the night of the third day coagulated on contact with the air in a matter of seconds. All signs pointed to a slow-acting poison, possibly a combination of mercury and toad skin. However, such a rapid process of internal decomposition indicates complex witchcraft or a curse. There was no proof of this, but the new owners of the estate, first and foremost the Bishop of Orleans, insisted, "The world must not doubt that the Lord sent death for sins, not the hand of man." At that moment, the name of Louise's old enemy, Duke Jacques de la Roche, resurfaced. Exiled 20 years earlier, he was summoned back. By Charles's decree, his lands, property, and title of marshal were restored to him. This decision caused panic. Servants who had served King Louis for decades realized that their time was up. In early December, one of the former palace chefs was found in a well, tied up with a note in his mouth. "I cooked for someone who became worse than carrion." A new expression appeared on the streets of Paris. "He breathes like Louis," meaning someone who is dying without peace. Healers, especially those who had survived the plague, began to discuss the king's illness as a separate phenomenon, the rotting of the living. One of them, a monk named Philip of Rouen, wrote, "In other cases, the body rots, but the will remains. Here, the will rotted, but the body still moved." This interpretation was later condemned as heresy, and the author himself was beheaded. Meanwhile, Charles became completely withdrawn. He stopped leaving the west wing of the palace, communicated only through a narrow window, and slept in the dungeons. The chronicles of Chamberlain Dominique Lebrun, found in the 19th century in the library of Amboise, state, "His Majesty demanded that the pillows be sprinkled with garlic, the rooms rubbed with bear fat, and every night the floor under the bed be checked for worms. He was not afraid of conspiracies, but of decay. He heard the walls breathing with decay." The loss of political control was accompanied by outbreaks of violence. Execution orders were signed without trial. Those suspected of connections with the deceased were considered a threat. The Inquisition was reinstated in the Paris diocese. 46 people were burned at the stake in 3 months, including 2 maids who had cared for Louis in his final days. They were accused of whispering about the secret of his curse. Their torture was described in detail in papal reports. Their tongues were cut out before they were bound and thrown into the fire. One of the few eyewitnesses to Louis's final days, librarian Michel de Laroigne, described in private letters, "In his last hours he stared at the ceiling and talked to himself. His voice changed. It became higher and squeaky. He claimed that he saw Judas in his mirror and that his own blood was trying to escape from his veins. He asked to have his feet nailed to the floor so that he would not go to hell." These letters, preserved in the archives of Besançon, were only published in the 20th century. At the time of the events described, they were kept in a locked chest to avoid temptation for the unprepared mind. Rumors that Louis's death was the result of a vendetta or divine punishment began to fuel peasant riots. In Limoges, a monastery was ransacked. The crowd demanded that the bones of the spider be handed over and burned. In Reims, 7 priests disappeared overnight. A wall was found covered in blood. "He is gone, but he remains among us." Charles was forced to turn to the church for support. He sent a petition to the Pope asking for his father's memory to be rehabilitated. There was no response. On the contrary, the legate who arrived at the Spring Council in Troyes openly declared, "The man who forbade touching has himself become a symbol of damnation. His death is a warning to all who rule without the fear of God." The people around Charles changed. He no longer trusted anyone who had served Louis. His personal physician was replaced by a witch doctor from Poitou. She offered him protection. Every morning he was to drink an infusion of aspen bark, eat a dead fly, and read 300 times, "I am not the one who rots." Charles did as he was told. A month later his hair fell out. Internal strife grew. The dukes gathered their private armies. The church spoke more and more openly about the need to reconsider the throne. Under these conditions, in the third spring after Louis's death, France entered a period of unrest that historians would later call the Great Schism. But it all started with a single order, with a single door that remained locked, with a body that was forbidden to touch. In the spring of 1486, 2.5 years after the death of Louis XIV, France was in a state of suppressed rebellion. The country trembled not from sabers and arrows, but from a sense of lawlessness, desolation, and fear. In the eyes of the people, the nobility and the clergy, royal power was no longer sacred. It had rotted away. All that remained was the smell. Charles, crowned without recognition and beset by rebellions, hardly left his tower in Amboise at this point. The last documents signed by his hand were written on parchment, stained with earth and sweat. His signature trembled, the words blurred. According to archivist Jacques Sorel, the letter was written in 2 sittings, 3 days apart. In between, His Majesty lost consciousness 3 times and changed his nightshirt twice, for it was soaked through with fear. On the night of May 27th, a fire broke out in the castle. As it turned out, one of the servants had lit a herbal infusion right outside the doors of the apartments, trying to cleanse the air of rot. This act was the last straw. Charles ordered the evacuation of the entire West Wing and went down to the dungeon, where, according to reports, he spent 32 days without light. The chronicles of the monk Bernard of Sens contain the following entry. "We have not seen His Majesty since Pentecost, but we have heard him wandering at night, praying in the dark and whispering that he hears his Father's footsteps. He is convinced that he is not dead." Meanwhile, Louis's body lay deep underground. But in May, an incident shook the country. Workers strengthening the crypts of the cathedral in Cluny accidentally opened a walled-up compartment from which a putrid vapor escaped. One of the masons fell down dead. A second fell into a delirium and repeated, "There is a spider, alive, calling my name." The local priest attributed the incident to unfinished penance during his lifetime. An emergency council of bishops was convened, but it ended without conclusions. No one wanted to touch the coffin. In June, a rumor spread throughout the country. Louis's body had not decomposed, but it had not been preserved either. It continued to ooze. A watery black mass found on the floor of the crypt sparked new accusations. The Dukes of Aquitaine and Limousin declared that the curse had not been lifted, but was feeding on France. They demanded a ritual purification of the throne. This meant the complete abdication of Charles and the transfer of the capital. The latter meant a schism. Charles refused. He went out to the people in Notre Dame in Paris. His face was covered with sores, his hair was gone, and his voice was hoarse. He tried to talk about peace, but no one listened to him. One of the eyewitnesses, a scribe from Reims, wrote, "People recoiled as if they had seen dead men. He smelled like a corpse." He was a corpse. 2 days later, Charles disappeared. He was missing for 7 days. Then he showed up in Rouen and announced that he was going to purify himself. He intended to rewrite his father's will, destroy the seals, and declare his previous decrees invalid. But that did not happen. On his 2nd day in Rouen, he was found unconscious, drinking vinegar and tearing the hair from his chest. He was taken to an abbey, where he spent the rest of his life. From that moment on, the final stage of disintegration began. France, without a real ruler, broke up into military districts. Each duke ruled his own region. The papal legate officially stripped Charles of his title and soon recognized his younger brother, Charles, Count of Angoulême, as king. But he refused. He said, "I will not sit on a throne where my father rots." Under these circumstances, a secret meeting of the nobility was held in November. It was decided to nullify the laws of Louis XV. His reign was recognized as a source of spiritual ulcer, and all his decrees were declared desecration of the cross and the throne. His name was removed from prayers, his coffin was left in Cluny, but the walls were bricked up twice as thick. From then on, no one was allowed to enter. A year later, France formally remained a unified kingdom, but in reality it was ruled by 7 people. Their decisions were coordinated by a council that met in Tours. Charles never returned. He died alone in a monastery at the age of 28, whispering in Latin the name of the father he had once feared. Louis's body was left untouched. It rotted away just as he had done in life. He forbade anyone to touch him, thereby erasing himself from the memory of the living. But his death was the beginning of the collapse of power, rituals, and faith in the immutability of the throne. He died as he had lived, surrounded by walls, in decay and fear. But his fear outlived him. Later chronicles will be cautious. They will write not about the king, but about the shadow that smelled of death. In academia, his name will be studied only in the context of symptoms of internal decay of the state. And the people, many years later, will still whisper, "Don't be like Louis, don't rot to death." For he who forbade anyone to touch him created a vacuum into which an entire kingdom fell.